In this presentation, I will be looking at Jekyll and Hyde in 6 key extracts that are chronological through the course of the novel. And in doing so, I'll be exploring some of the key themes, in particular the battle between light and dark, or good and evil, the fears of Victorian society, and the two characters of Gabriel Utterson and Edward Hyde, considering the way in which both of those characters progress through the novel. Before we get into the extracts, it's important to consider some of the key contexts surrounding the novel. And the first one we're going to look at is the notion of appearances and judgment. This idea that Victorian society was one concerned with appearances, and as a result of that had a fear of judgment. We see many of the characters with a great desire to live up to the archetype of the Victorian gentleman, in particular Gabriel Utterson, who is terrified of Victorian society's judgment to the point that he drinks gin when he is alone. He never visits the theatre. He shows a remarkable level of self-restraint and self-control. And Jekyll's creation of Hyde is, of course, a manifestation of this fear of judgment. He creates Hyde in order to express his inner desires without the fear of judgment from Victorian society. The next important contextual element to consider is Charles Darwin and his publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859. Darwin's theories challenged the existing beliefs of Victorian society, a society which was governed by a strict religious moral code. Along came Darwin's theories and challenged all of those ideas about God creating the earth. And with that came an uncertainty. And we see in the novel Hyde perhaps as a representation of Darwin's theories in many ways. He is definitely something pre-evolved. He's often dehumanized and animalized, something troglodytic he is described as. And society's inability to describe Hyde and to deal with Hyde perhaps reflects their inability to accept and deal with Darwin's theories. And we see again in the character of Utterson and others their refusal to acknowledge Hyde's humanity is perhaps a way by which they can deny what Hyde truly represents. Victorian society, after all, is one that is obsessed with making progress, and with Hyde representing a regression, a step back if you like, he is certainly something that the members of Victorian society in the novel seek to avoid and dismiss. And the third element of context here is the notion of duality. Stevenson is certainly concerned with what he saw as the duality of man, the idea that we all have a dark side, and in particular the notion that the suppression of that dark side will only increase its intensity. There is certainly evidence in the novel to suggest that we need to embrace our dark side in order to be complete, and in repressing the dark side, in ignoring it, it starts to take over. But Stevenson is also concerned with the duality of Victorian society. It is a society which is hypocritical in many ways. There is the pristine, wealthy exterior of London's upper-class neighbourhoods, but behind those lies the dirty, poverty-stricken, immoral backstreets of London. And we see evidence of both sides of that society in the novel. This is perhaps inspired by Stevenson's own experience growing up in Edinburgh. He was a gentleman by day, but he would visit the brothels and drinking houses of the back streets of Edinburgh by night. So he is well aware of the kind of hypocritical presentation of middle and upper class society. As a result of this duality, there is an inherent fear of class transgression, the idea that the middle classes can be usurped by the lower working classes, or in fact they could themselves sink into the lower and working classes. Many of these middle class men in the novel certainly behave as if they belong in lower class society, and that is perhaps why their fear of regression is so real. We're going to start in chapter 1, and this is the moment where Enfield and Utterson are taking one of their strolls through London, and they stumble across a door, and Enfield remembers a story about Edward Hyde, and he recounts it to Utterson. It is, of course, the moment where Hyde tramples on the young girl and feels absolutely no remorse. It's interesting at the opening of this extract that Enfield is particularly concerned with light. He says there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps all lighted up. There is a constant battle between light and dark in this novel. Light seemingly representing the goodness, the good moral structure of society, and darkness representing that slightly more sinister, evil side of man and society. And Enfield seems to be desperate here to establish light as the dominant force. But in doing so, he immediately hints that there is a fear of the darkness, and it is Hyde that represents that darkness both here and in the novel as a whole. Later in this extract, it is the presentation of Hyde that is so interesting. He tramples calmly on the young girl, rejecting the usual sentiments of human beings, that sense of remorse. He feels no remorse whatsoever for trampling on his young victim. But significantly, it's the way that Enfield and other members of Victorian society describe Hyde that is so important. Here Enfield says it wasn't like a man, it was like some damned juggernaut. First of all, the repetition of it rather than he is interesting, because Hyde is dehumanised here. And then by using the simile like some damned juggernaut, Hyde is further dehumanised. A juggernaut being an unstoppable mythical force. So Hyde is removed from the human realm, and this happens over and over again in the novel, both in this reference and in the way in which he is animalised throughout the novel. And it's important for Victorian society to do that. If Hyde becomes human, they have to acknowledge what he represents. And as we've already discussed, he of course represents the idea of regression in a society fixated on progress. He represents the dark side of mankind in a society of men who are seeking to maintain their facade of moral goodness. And so by creating Hyde as something animal or something other or something mythical or fantastical, they can dismiss what he represents. And in the reaction of Sawbones in particular here, we see a clear reason why Victorian society wants to dismiss Edward Hyde. The Sawbones, the doctor, who is described initially as emotional as a bagpipe, he's reminiscent of Gabriel Utterson here. He lacks emotion, he's full of self-control. But as soon as he sees Hyde, Enfield tells us that the doctor turns sick and white with a desire to kill him. Now, first of all, it's significant that Hyde has the ability to instantly change the characters of those who come into contact with him. He has an ability to change the natural order of things. But also we see in Sawbones' reaction that the doctor has this dark monstrosity within him. He turns immediately upon seeing Hyde and becomes just as monstrous as Hyde. So perhaps the characters see Hyde as so dangerous because they recognise what he is, and they have that side of themselves within them too. They have a darker, evil, inherently evil side within them that they refuse to embrace. We then move on to chapter 2, and this is Utterson's nightmare at the start of chapter 2. And it's important really in First of all, furthering our understanding of Edward Hyde and Victorian Society's reaction to him, but also in seeing the progression or regression, if you like, in Gabriel Utterson's character. At the start of the novel, Gabriel Utterson is a man who embodies the Victorian moral code of restraint and self-control. He is never lighted by a smile, it says. He drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages. But as soon as he hears about Hyde, let's not forget he hasn't even met Hyde yet, we learn that Utterson's imagination was also engaged, or rather enslaved. And then later in the passage it says that he had an inordinate curiosity to behold the features of the real Mr. Hyde. Utterson instantly becomes almost obsessed with discovering Edward Hyde. So we see again Hyde's ability to change the natural order, but we're also seeing a slightly darker, more sinister side of Gabriel Utterson emerging straight away. It's interesting how Utterson views Hyde in his dream. Once again, he is dehumanized. He is a figure, twice regarded as a figure here, who had no face. He's depicted in almost ghost-like terms. The Two-Face is haunted the lawyer all night. So even in Utterson's dream, Hyde is dehumanized. He's created as other in order for Utterson to dismiss what he represents. But there is a really interesting phrase here. Don't forget, in chapter 1 he's described as that damned juggernaut, a juggernaut coming from hell. Whereas here in the nightmare he is that human juggernaut. So in Utterson's dream, and let's not forget dreams are perhaps a representation of our own inner fears, Hyde has become slightly more human-like than he was in the opening chapter. There seems to be a recognition in Utterson's subconscious that Hyde can't be dismissed as something other. And that's why Hyde is so dangerous, because they start to recognise increasingly that Hyde is actually a human being, and therefore they have to confront what he represents as a human being too. We'll move on to chapter 4 now, and this is the moment where Hyde brutally murders Sir Danvers Carew. And it's an interesting passage to understand the progression in Hyde's character and also the progression in what he represents. Let's have a look at the murder itself. He broke out in a great flame of anger, brandishing the cane. He broke out of all bounds. He clubbed him to the earth with ape-like fury, trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows. The bones were audibly shattered. The verbs are really interesting here. Brandishing, broke, trampling, clubbed, shattered, hailing. Really aggressive, dynamic verbs. Much more aggressive than the verb trampled in the opening chapter. So we're seeing a progression in Hyde's violence here. And as I said in the bit about context at the start, there's this idea, and this is part of Hyde's danger. He represents the dark side of mankind. If we don't embrace that dark side, and they're certainly not embracing Hyde in this novel, it will grow in strength and increasingly take over. And we see that here in Hyde's murder of Carew. The other interesting reference, of course, is ape-like fury. He's being dehumanized again. He represents something pre-evolved, perhaps. But the really interesting reference is how Hyde broke out in a great flame of anger. The flame becomes a motif in the novel, or fire becomes a motif in the novel to represent Hyde. Flames are interesting because they start off small, but they have the ability to spread. Just as Hyde, as a representation of man's evil side, might start off small, but there is a fear of it spreading. And in there is certainly the fear of Victorian society that Hyde's influence will spread. And then the idea that he broke out of all bounds. Well, this is the notion that Hyde breaks the mould of Victorian society and breaks the mould of humanity, and that's why he's so terrifying. He doesn't live by the rules of society or the rules of mankind. Later in chapter 4, this is just after the murder of Carew, and Utterson has heard about the murder, and then he accompanies a policeman on a journey to Hyde's property to have a look round and to find evidence of Hyde's involvement in the crime. It's probably my favourite section of the entire novel, and the one thing I particularly love about this section is the battle that we see between light and dark. Light and dark as a motif represents the battle between good and evil in the novel, represents the battle between the middle class and the lower class perhaps, and increasingly in this section of the text, as with the previous section where we saw the murder, we start to see the dark side taking over. First of all, it's the first fog of the season. There's a great chocolate-coloured pall lowered over heaven. Even the light of God is being obscured here. And then we get the glow of a rich, lurid brown and the haggard shaft of daylight which bursts through, or tries to burst through, as the fog breaks up. But it's interesting that the daylight is described as haggard here, haggard being something weakened and something broken down. The light is struggling to overcome the darkness now. And then again, it's lamps which had never been extinguished or had been kindled afresh to combat this mournful reinvasion of darkness. The light is really struggling now, and the darkness is seen as an invading enemy that is starting to take over. And this is Hyde's influence increasing in the novel, and also the idea of the darkness. If we repress it, it gains in strength. Utterson's reaction is fascinating. The fog lifts and Utterson sees the dismal quarter of Soho under these changing glimpses with its muddy ways and slatternly passengers. So the fog lifts and Utterson sees those dirty, decrepit back streets of London, Soho, for the first time. And there's a recognition, it seems, in Utterson's mind of that duality of Victorian society that I talked about earlier. Utterson has been able to deny its existence, but here he sees it, and when he sees it, it appears to him like a district of some city in a nightmare. It is a nightmarish vision for Utterson, because we see here that very real fear of class transgression, that very real fear that there is a darker element to society that might take over and disrupt the dominance of the middle classes, of which Utterson is a part. It's also part of Utterson's attempt to deny its existence. If he can dismiss it as a nightmare, he can pretend that it doesn't exist, and he can carry on living in his very, very comfortable upper middle class lifestyle. In chapter 7, we see Utterson and Enfield again out on one of their walks, and they come across Jekyll's property. And first of all, the description of light and dark is really interesting again. The court was very cool and a little damp and full of premature twilight, although the sky high up overhead was still bright with sunset. There is that conflict of light and dark, and the darkness is now seen to be something unnatural, premature twilight. The light is struggling again to compete. And they see Jekyll sat up in his window, and he is described like some disconsolate prisoner. A really telling description of Jekyll. This appears to be a man who is trapped in some way, who is imprisoned in some way. First of all, he's probably imprisoned by the judgment of Victorian society. He knows he can't release his inner fears and his inner desires without being judged. But also I think he's increasingly imprisoned by Hyde. And this is the idea that Hyde, as a representation of the dark side, is starting to take over Jekyll, and that is why he's so dangerous and so feared. And we see later on in this extract the transformation, the beginning of the transformation of Jekyll into Hyde, and we once again see that Jekyll is now struggling to control this transformation. Earlier in the novel he says, I can be rid of Hyde whenever I choose. He was completely in control. Now he seems to be losing that control. The smile was struck out of his face and succeeded by an expression of such abject terror and despair. He doesn't seem to have a choice now about his transformation from Jekyll into Hyde. It happens almost naturally as Hyde's influence and the dark side starts to take over. Evil is definitely winning the battle over good here. And Utterson and Enfield's reaction is really significant. It says, they saw it, but that glimpse had been sufficient, and they turned and left the court without a word, in silence. And the extract finishes with Utterson saying, God forgive us, God forgive us. It seems that Utterson has recognised that transformation in Jekyll, but he refuses to help his friend. Utterson is so obsessed with maintaining appearances that he will abandon his friend at his time of greatest need. So we see in Utterson's reaction here perhaps a criticism from Stevenson of the hypocrisy of Victorian obsession with appearances, and that is represented most powerfully through the character of Utterson. And that hypocrisy is most powerfully emphasised through Utterson's behaviour in chapter 8. This is the last night, the moment where Poole calls on Utterson and they go to Jekyll's property and they go up to the cabinet with the axe to break down the cabinet door to discover Hyde in Jekyll's cabinet, who they believe has either murdered or kidnapped Henry Jekyll. But just look at Utterson's behaviour here. Jekyll, cried Utterson with a loud voice, I demand to see you. He paused a moment, but there came no reply. I give you fair warning, our suspicions are aroused, and I must and shall see you, he resumed, if not by fair means, then by foul, if not by of your consent, then by brute force. This is an utter and complete transformation of the man we saw earlier in the novella. Never lighted by a smile, remember, completely self-controlled, completely emotionless. Here he has completely transformed into an almost brutal, savage man. I demand to see you. Look at the imperative verbs here. I must and shall see you. By brute force, he says. He has become almost as monstrous as the character that he fears so greatly. I mean, Hyde pleads for mercy, and Utterson's response is, down with the door, Poole. Here is a transformation of extreme means. And then we see them breaking down the door. Poole swung the axe. The blow shook the building. The red baize door leaped against the lock. The panels crashed. The frame bounded. The lock burst in sunder. Look at the verb choices here. Shook and leaped and crashed and bounded and burst. They're reminiscent of the verbs we saw Stevenson use for Hyde's murder of Carew, almost as if to highlight that there's very little difference in terms of violence and evil and monstrosity between Hyde and here Utterson and Poole. This extract here is really significant in highlighting that the darkness exists within everybody, even in the most self-controlled man in the novel, Gabriel Utterson. And when the door finally collapses and they burst into the room, it says the besiegers, appalled by their own riot. They are perhaps appalled because they have realised the darkness within themselves. They have come to terms with the fact that they have this monster within themselves. the thing that Utterson has tried to deny so fervently throughout the novel. It's important, I think, that when they finally get into the room, it is described as the most common place that night in London. It is really ordinary, and it has to be ordinary for Stevenson to make his point that this could be anyone in Victorian society. This behaviour is not unique to Edward Hyde. The darkness could exist in every single one of us. And finally, the depiction of Hyde, the dead Edward Hyde, is significant. He is still twitching, and the cords of his face still moved with a semblance of life. Even in death, Hyde is dead, but the darkness that he represents cannot be ignored and dismissed. It still seems to continue on. And it is also significant that Jekyll dies in the form of Edward Hyde. The darkness has won out here. The evil side of humanity has won, probably because it wasn't embraced and it was repressed for so long. And therein lies Stevenson's lesson about the duality of mankind. Acknowledge it, or it will take over you. I hope that's been a useful look at those 6 extracts, and it's acted as a useful summary of the events of the novella, but also will give you the means to explore some of those themes of duality and fear and what Hyde represents, but also the way in which Utterson's character develops throughout the novella and the significance of that development in revealing Stevenson's message about Victorian society and about human nature.